Hi, my name is Linda Rós, and I'm a PhD student looking at immigrant women's experiences of employment-based violence in Iceland. The title of my presentation is called The Role of Critical Education in Shifting Paradigms that Perpetuate Violence Against Immigrant Women in Iceland. This project is a part of a larger research led by Brynja Halldórsdóttir, looking at the experience of immigrant women in Iceland of both intimate partner violence and employment-based violence. The International Labour Office has declared that immigrant women are made most vulnerable to employment-based violence globally. The United Nations General Assembly in 2017 has adopted the resolution on addressing employment-based violence against immigrant women, also stating that this group is the most vulnerable to experience employment-based violence. And we see this reflected in Iceland, and specifically in 2018, immigrant women collected narratives describing violence they experienced both in and without the Icelandic labor market, and they published it in Kjarnin during the 2018 Me Too movement. Research that looks at employment-based violence against immigrant women is extremely limited globally and virtually non-existent in Iceland. However, there are reports that we will go into. There's also a lack of research that include the active voices and experience of vulnerable populations. And what we know about the status of foreign workers in Iceland is that last year in 2019, 4 major reports were released, and all of them described the vulnerability of immigrants, and especially immigrant women, to experience employment-based violence, whether that's violations of labor rights or sexual violence or sexual harassment against women. We're seeing that immigrants and immigrant women are most likely to being overqualified and not getting jobs that reflect their educational qualifications. But none of these reports were specifically looking at immigrant women's experience of employment-based violence, but the outcome of all of these reports are showing that this is an issue that needs serious and immediate attention. What we also are seeing is that weak legislation is compounding the experience of immigrant women's, compounding immigrant women's experiences of employment-based violence. And there's an error on this slide, it says non-discriminatory employment laws were implemented in 2018, but it's a non-discriminatory law were implemented in 2018, but they specifically state that they don't include the labor market. But in 2018, law number 86, called the Equal Treatment of Workers in Iceland, also state in Article 1, Chapter 1, that those laws also they do not cover the differential treatment of individuals in the labor market based on their address or their statelessness. Report that looked at the abuse of power in the Icelandic labor market generally had also included a small section where they talk about violence against immigrants, and they highlighted that employees' rights are significantly weakened by current immigration law. And the report called in Icelandic jafnrétti innflytjenda á atvinnumarkaði, or the equal treatment of immigrants in the Icelandic labour market, highlights there's neither adequate monitoring of the application of anti-discrimination legislation or immigrants' knowledge of their existence. And the report, looking at the status and situation of immigrant women in Iceland, highlights that research is showing that women do not know what options are available to them, immigrant women. And they, for example, don't always know where to go when they experience sexual violence. There are systemic barriers for immigrants in the Icelandic labour market. And ISE, which is the Confederation of trade unions in Iceland for the private sector and part of the public sector, and whose job is to safeguard the rights of employees in Iceland, published a report last year describing infringements of labor rights. And they talked about that fewer violations happen when more Icelandic people are employed. And language barriers, less knowledge of labor rights, and unions and employers taking deliberate advantage of foreigners is rampant across Iceland. The report on the the equal treatment of immigration in the Icelandic labour market talks about legal barriers to get your education and work experience acknowledged. And they implore that Icelandic legislation and Icelandic government has to make the process of assessing education and works experience more simple, and they need to take active measures to help facilitate integration while individuals in the process of getting their education work experience acknowledged legally. So we're seeing these clear signs of discriminations and even recorded instances of racism in the Icelandic labour market. And this gets compounded for women outside the EEA and EU and for women of colour. And for example, for women outside of the EU, legal process is often very slow, and this in turn makes them dependent on their spouses and makes them vulnerable in seeking their rights. Skaftadóttir and Loftsdóttir in a research from 2009, they discuss how understandings of multiculturalism in Iceland is influenced by Icelandic nationalism, resulting in fragmented and racialized understandings of culture. They further point out a level of stratification in Icelandic society where nationalities are weighted differently in terms of their cultural proximity to Icelandic tradition, language, and whiteness. This means the further you are from Western societies, the more you're othered within the Icelandic paradigm of foreign cultures. This gets reflected in institutions and its organizational cultures. Organizational culture referring to the internalized shared values within organization. And this plays a significant role in how institutions foster work environments that are free from discriminatory or violent practices. The International Labour Office in Geneva has also identified the importance of the role of organization cultures in relation to employment-based violence against foreign women, saying that there are simply no cultural safety nets to protect immigrant women and female workers. And this is important because successful integration policies are determined by multicultural understandings. This brings us to the role of critical education. What is the role of critical education in addressing this? And the goal of critical pedagogical education is to use education towards the emancipation of the oppression of vulnerable groups and to raise issues of social justice and democracy, and that critical consciousness is raised and that it's grounded in the voices and experience of vulnerable populations, or and especially the groups that are being researched, that this research is led by the voices of the group that it represents. And so what we're understanding and the educational value of the project is presented through informing primary prevention guidelines, initiatives for educational purposes, and action strategies that build competency and informational flow. We need theoretical, methodological, and pedagogical tools to challenge racism, sexism, classism, and work towards social justice. And this project addresses a gap in its contribution to informing culturally appropriate responses that are based or grounded in immigrant women's experience and made available to them in multiple languages. And so the end goal is creating tools to raise awareness and increase access to important information regarding labor rights and informing policies. This research, the PhD project and the larger project led by Brynja Halldórsdóttir, is funded by RANIS, the Icelandic Center of Research, and it's funded by Jafnréttissjóður Íslands, or the Icelandic Equality Fund. And yeah, that's it for today, and thank you very much.